There is a moment, quiet and ordinary, when a bird lands on your window and looks directly at you, and something inside you goes completely still. Not because you're afraid, not because anything obvious has happened, but because, for a second, it feels like you've been noticed. Maybe it only happened once. Or maybe it's been happening again and again at almost the same time each morning, until it started to feel familiar. And each time you tell yourself the same thing. It's just a bird. Just coincidence. Just one of those things. But what if it isn't? What if that moment, the stillness you felt, wasn't random at all? Because what we're about to talk about is something millions of people experience, and almost no one can fully explain. A bird, a specific bird, returning to your window, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, as if it remembers something about you, as if it expects something, as if, in some quiet way, it's checking on you. Sign number 1. Your window is a mirror, and sometimes the bird isn't watching you at all. This is where we have to begin, because without this, everything else becomes easy to misunderstand. When a bird returns to a window again and again, one of the most well-documented explanations is something called territorial reflection behavior, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The bird sees its own reflection in the glass, interprets it as another bird, and responds the only way it knows how, by returning, confronting, and trying to drive the intruder away. And because that reflection never leaves, the behavior repeats. Again and again. This has been studied extensively, particularly by researchers at places like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it shows up most often during breeding season, when territorial instincts are at their peak and even a perceived rival is enough to trigger a response. You'll usually recognize it by the intensity. The bird doesn't just sit, pecks at the glass. It flutters in short bursts. It positions itself in a way that feels confrontational. Not curious, not calm, but reactive. And this matters more than most people realize, because not every bird at your window is doing this. And the difference between a bird that is reacting to its own reflection and a bird that is intentionally returning, quietly, repeatedly, is something subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. One feels like agitation. The other feels deliberate. So before you assume that every visit means something deeper, you have to ask a simple question. Is the bird reacting, or is it observing? Because once you start noticing that difference, you begin to realize that some of what's been happening at your window doesn't fit the pattern of reflection at all. And that's where things start to change. Stay with me, because sign number 2 is where we move beyond instinct and into something much harder to explain. Sign number 2. Your yard has become a landmark, and somewhere in that map you are part of it. Birds don't just move randomly through space the way people sometimes assume. They remember, not loosely, not approximately, but with a level of precision that is difficult to fully appreciate until you see the data behind it. Studies on common backyard species, particularly birds like chickadees and nuthatches, have shown that they can remember thousands of individual locations where they've stored food, sometimes across large areas, and return to them weeks or even months later with remarkable accuracy. Not most of them, thousands. Which means that when a bird returns to your window at nearly the same time from the same direction and settles in almost the exact same place, it is not wandering. It is navigating. And more importantly, it is returning to something it has already learned. Now here's where this becomes personal. Because birds don't just map places. They map patterns. And in some cases, they map people. Research coming out of places like the University of Cambridge has shown that certain bird species, especially corvids like crows and jays, are capable of recognizing individual human faces and distinguishing between people who are safe, people who are neutral, and people who pose a threat. And once that classification is made, it tends to stick. Not just for a day, but over long periods of time. So if you've ever sat near that window in the morning, if you've been there consistently, even without thinking about it, If your presence has formed a pattern that repeats, then it's entirely possible that the bird you keep seeing has incorporated you into its understanding of that environment. Not just the house, not just the yard. Your shape behind the glass, your movement, your timing. And once something becomes part of that internal map, birds don't ignore it. They return to it. They check it. They update it. Which means this: if a bird keeps coming back to your window, not aggressively, not randomly, but in a way that feels consistent, almost expectant, then it may not just be remembering the place. It may be remembering you. And that's a very different kind of interaction. Because once recognition enters the picture, behavior starts to change. Subtly at first, but noticeably if you're paying attention. And that leads directly into the next sign. Because what happens when the bird that keeps returning isn't just any bird, but one that, for a very long time, has carried a meaning people don't easily dismiss? Stay with me, because sign number 3 is where science and something much older begin to overlap. Sign number 3. The bird at your window may be one that has carried meaning long before you ever stop to notice it. And this is where things begin to feel different. Because up to this point, everything we've talked about can be explained through behavior, memory, and pattern recognition. Clear systems, observable responses. But not everything people experience with birds stays in that category. There are certain birds that, over time, have come to hold a kind of weight in human culture that goes beyond simple observation. Not because of one study, not because of one explanation, but because the same experience keeps happening across different places, different people, and different generations. The one that comes up most often is the cardinal. If you've ever seen one up close, you already understand part of it. That red, almost impossibly vivid, especially against a quiet morning, or a gray sky, or the stillness of winter. It doesn't blend in. It stands out immediately, and for many people that moment doesn't feel neutral. It feels significant. There is a belief, widely shared across the United States, that when a cardinal appears, it carries a message connected to someone who is no longer here. Not as a metaphor, not as a poetic idea, but as something people feel very directly in the moment it happens. And this isn't some fringe concept. It shows up in traditions, in symbols, in the kinds of objects people keep in their homes, and in the stories they tell quietly to each other when something like this happens. But here's the part that matters. This channel doesn't ask you to accept a belief. It asks you to notice a pattern. Because when people describe these moments, they don't describe random sightings. They describe something specific. A bird that appears closer than expected. That stays longer than usual. That arrives at a time that already meant something. And very often, it happens after a loss. Now I'm not going to tell you what that means. And I'm not going to try to define it for you, because the moment you force an explanation, you lose something about the experience itself. What I will say is this: when something happens consistently enough across enough people, in ways that feel almost identical, it deserves attention. Not immediate belief, but attention. And if the bird at your window is one that carries that kind of history, that kind of association, then what you're experiencing may not feel the same as a simple behavioral pattern. It may feel heavier than that, and that's where things begin to shift again. Because the next sign isn't about what the bird sees. It's about what the bird hears. Stay with me, because sign number 4 is where the outside world and your inside space begin to connect in a way most people never consider. Sign number 4. The bird isn't just reacting to what it sees outside. It may be responding to something it can hear inside. This is the part that tends to surprise people because we're used to thinking of birds as visual creatures, noticing movement, reacting to shapes, scanning for threats. But their relationship with sound is far more precise than most people realize. Certain bird species are capable of detecting frequencies that fall outside the range of human hearing. while others are highly sensitive to subtle patterns, rhythms, and repeated tones that, to us, fade into the background of daily life. A television playing quietly, a radio in another room, the cadence of a human voice, even the difference between silence and a space that is occupied. Research has shown that birds like mockingbirds and starlings, both common in residential areas, will approach unfamiliar or consistent sounds with a level of curiosity that goes beyond simple awareness. They don't just hear it, they investigate it, they move closer, they stay longer, they orient themselves in a way that suggests focused attention. And it goes further than that. Studies on European robins, which behave in ways very similar to the American robin, have shown that these birds will respond to recorded human voices in ways that look less like reflex and more like interest. They approach, they pause, they tilt their heads in that very specific way that indicates they are listening, not just reacting. Now think about your own space for a moment. The sounds that repeat every morning, the things you say without thinking, the routines that create a kind of rhythm inside your home. If you speak out loud, if you pray, if you play music, if your mornings follow a pattern that rarely changes, then it's possible that what's drawing that bird back isn't just the window, but something beyond it. Because to the bird, your home is not silent. It is active. It carries signals, patterns, presence. And if those signals repeat, day after day at nearly the same time, then what you're witnessing when that bird returns may not be coincidence. It may be response, which means, in a way most people never consider, you have already been heard. And that connects directly to what comes next. Because once something responds to a pattern, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why that time? Why that exact moment? Sign number 5. The timing of these visits is far more precise than most people are willing to admit. This is something you have to pay attention to, not casually, not in passing, but deliberately, because one of the most common details people mention, when they describe a bird that keeps returning to their window, is not just that it comes back, but when it comes back. Not roughly the same time, not somewhere in the morning, but almost exactly, within minutes, sometimes within seconds, before the coffee is ready, just as the light shifts, right at that quiet point in the morning when everything feels still. From a scientific perspective, there is an explanation for part of this. Birds operate on internal biological clocks, circadian rhythms that are incredibly precise, often more consistent than human schedules, and closely tied to changes in light, temperature, and environmental cues. Research has shown that many songbirds begin their daily activity within very narrow windows of time, triggered not by a clock on a wall, but by subtle shifts in the world around them. So in that sense, the timing isn't random. It's regulated, predictable, even expected, but that only explains part of what people experience. Because the question that remains isn't just why the bird is active at that time. It's why it's at your window, out of every possible place it could go. Every ledge, every branch, every rooftop, every yard. Why yours? And when people are asked that question, when they stop and really think about it, the answers they give tend to follow a pattern that is difficult to ignore. They say things like, "That was his time. That's when she used to call. That's when we sat together in the morning." Moments that already carried meaning, long before the bird appeared. Now I'm not here to tell you what to believe. And I'm not here to force an explanation onto something that may not fit neatly into one. But when timing aligns with memory, when repetition aligns with something personal, it becomes harder to dismiss it as coincidence. Not impossible, but harder. And if you've noticed that the visits happen at a time that already meant something to you, then what you're experiencing may not just be biological rhythm. It may feel like something else is being reflected back to you. And that brings us to the next sign. Because once timing becomes meaningful, attention begins to change. Sign number 6. The bird has made eye contact with you, and for a moment longer than it should have, it didn't look away. This is different from a bird simply noticing movement, different from a glance, different from scanning the environment the way birds naturally do. This is something more specific, more focused. If you've experienced it, you already know the difference. A bird lands, settles, and then, instead of continuing what it was doing, it turns, aligns itself, and looks directly at you. Not past you, not around you, at you. And then it holds that gaze. For a second, maybe 2, sometimes longer than that. Long enough for you to become aware of it. Long enough for something inside you to shift slightly, even if you can't explain why. From a scientific perspective, there is real substance behind part of this behavior. Birds, particularly species like crows, have demonstrated the ability to track where humans are looking, to recognize when attention is directed at them, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. Research from cognitive studies has shown that some birds operate with what's called a theory of mind, meaning they understand at some level that other beings have awareness, perspective, and intention. They know when you're watching them. But what's less understood and far more difficult to explain is when that attention appears to move in the other direction. Because people don't just describe being noticed, they describe being seen. And not briefly, not accidentally, but in a way that feels sustained, intentional. What makes this even more difficult to categorize is that this kind of behavior isn't limited to the species we expect to show high cognitive ability. It's been reported with birds that, on paper, aren't supposed to behave this way. Small songbirds, doves, robins, birds that should be more reactive, more cautious, less engaged. And yet, the descriptions people give are strikingly similar. A bird that looks, holds, doesn't startle, doesn't retreat immediately, as if, for a moment, the usual boundary between observer and observed becomes less clear. Now, there may be explanations for parts of this. Curiosity, habituation, environmental comfort. But those explanations don't fully account for the feeling people describe in that moment. And that feeling is consistent. That something, however small, has just acknowledged you. And once you experience that, even once, it becomes very difficult to go back to thinking of it as nothing. Which leads us to the final sign. Because everything we've talked about so far builds toward one question. When did it start? Sign number 7. The visits began after someone left. And as soon as you hear that, you probably already know who you're thinking about. This is the part where people stop explaining. Not because there's nothing to say, but because what they've experienced doesn't fit easily into words. When you look back at the moment the bird first appeared, really look at it, not just the detail of the bird itself, but the timing, the context, what was happening in your life. Very often there is a line, a before, and an after. Before, the window was just a window. The yard was just a yard. Birds came and went without meaning. And then something changed. A loss. A phone call, a hospital room, a goodbye that didn't feel complete. And somewhere after that, the bird appeared. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, consistently, returning in a way that didn't feel like everything that came before. Now I want to be careful here, and I want to be honest. Science does not currently have a mechanism to explain this kind of connection. There is no study that can tell you why a specific bird would begin appearing at a specific place, at a specific time, tied to a specific moment in someone's life. But that doesn't mean people aren't experiencing it. Because across thousands of accounts, across different states, different backgrounds, different beliefs, the pattern repeats. A bird appears after a loss. It returns. It behaves in a way that feels different. And the person experiencing it feels something they can't quite dismiss. Not certainty, but not randomness either. Something in between. And when people talk about it, when they allow themselves to be honest about what it felt like in that moment, the language they use is remarkably consistent. Felt like a presence. Felt like a message. Felt like someone somehow was still aware of them. Now, whether that is something external, something internal, or something we simply don't yet understand, is a question that doesn't have a clear answer. But the experience itself, that part is real. And if you've had it even once, even briefly, then you already know that dismissing it completely doesn't feel quite right either. Because sometimes what matters most isn't proving what something is. It's recognizing what it meant to you in the moment it happened. And if a bird has been coming to your window, especially after you've lost someone, and somewhere in the back of your mind you've asked yourself, even for a second, could it be? That question doesn't make you irrational. It makes you human, and it means you were paying attention. So here's what we've seen. Not one explanation, but several. Some grounded in science, some rooted in pattern, some carried through culture and belief. A reflection that explains repetition. A memory system that places you inside the bird's world. Sounds that travel beyond what you notice. Timing that aligns too precisely to ignore. Moments of eye contact that feel intentional. And visits that begin when something in your life has changed. Some of these are measurable. Some of them are not. Most of them exist somewhere in between. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Has a bird ever come to your window or appeared in your life at a moment that felt like more than coincidence? Not just something you noticed, but something you remembered, a moment that stayed with you. If it has, tell me about it. What bird was it? What was happening in your life at the time? Because one of the most consistent things this kind of experience reveals is that you're not the only one who's had it. And sometimes hearing that matters more than having an explanation. If this reached you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need to hear it too. I'll see you in the next one.